When people hear the words Loch Ness Monster, most imagine the same image. A long neck rising from dark waters, ripples spreading out as though something massive just slipped beneath the surface. The outline is hazy, always just out of reach, always leaving more questions than answers. That image has been repeated in books, in newspapers, on television, and now across the internet. But to understand why this story has endured for nearly a century, and why it still pulls thousands of visitors to the Scottish Highlands every year, we have to start far before the famous photographs. The roots of this legend run deep, tangled into folklore, geography, and the universal human attraction to the unknown. The loch itself is the beginning. Loch Ness is not just any body of water, it stretches for more than 20 miles through the Highlands, long and narrow, hemmed in by steep hills. It is one of the largest and deepest freshwater lakes in the British Isles. Its depth reaches more than 700 feet in places, and the water is stained dark by peat, which makes visibility low even a few feet beneath the surface. Standing at the shore, you cannot help but feel a sense of mystery. The surface can be calm one moment and then suddenly stir with strange patterns of waves. Because the loch is so deep and dark, it feels bottomless, a perfect stage for stories of hidden creatures. Scotland has always been a land rich with folklore. The people who lived there for centuries told stories of water spirits known as kelpies, supernatural beings said to haunt rivers and lochs. These kelpies often took the form of horses that lured travellers into the water, never to be seen again. The water was alive in these tales, dangerous and unpredictable. Even before anyone spoke the words Loch Ness Monster, the cultural imagination was already primed to see something uncanny in the loch. A deep, dark body of water almost demanded a legend to match it. The first written story connected to the loch dates back to the 6th century. A monk named Adam Nan wrote the Life of Street, Columba, which included an account of the saint encountering a strange water beast in the River Ness. According to the story, the creature had attacked a swimmer, and Columba made the sign of the cross, commanding the beast to retreat. The tale was told as a miracle story, meant to show the saint's holy power. Whether or not it was true, it is striking that even in that early time, the waters around Loch Ness were linked with something frightening and otherworldly. From then on, the loch carried a reputation for mystery. Centuries passed, and stories would surface occasionally, often vague, often told in whispers. People spoke of disturbances in the water, of animals that did not seem to belong. Most of these accounts never travelled far beyond the Highlands. They were local curiosities, the kinds of tales that linger around campfires or are passed from one generation to the next without ever entering the broader public imagination. That changed in the early 20th century. The 1930s were the era when the Loch Ness Monster as we know it truly entered the world stage. In 1933, a local couple reported seeing a large creature rolling and plunging in the loch. The story was picked up by newspapers, and from there, the legend exploded. Within months, people from all over Britain and beyond were talking about a monster in the Highlands. The timing was important. This was an age when mass media was expanding, when a story could travel quickly through print, and when people were especially fascinated by the natural world. Dinosaurs had been discovered and reconstructed in museums, and the idea that one might still be alive in a hidden Scottish lake felt almost believable. The loch itself cooperated in the creation of mystery. Because it is so deep and murky, it is easy to imagine something large hiding below the surface, rarely breaking through. The waves and wakes created by boats, by wind, by shifting currents, can all appear strange to the human eye. A log floating in the distance, a line of otters swimming, even the way light plays on water can create the impression of something massive moving just under the surface. Once the newspapers had planted the idea of a monster, every odd sight became possible evidence. That is one of the reasons the Loch Ness Monster story grew so quickly. It combined three ingredients: an evocative setting, a long tradition of water lore, and a modern moment ready to believe in prehistoric survival. The loch was already mysterious. The culture was already rich with legends of water spirits, and the public imagination was already primed by dinosaurs and exploration. The result was explosive. Suddenly, Loch Ness was not just a lake. It was a stage for the possibility that the world still held secrets, that something ancient might still be lurking out of sight. When you stand on the shore of Loch Ness even today, it is not difficult to see why the story stuck. The loch is vast, stretching so far that the opposite shore feels distant and hazy. The water is dark, refusing to give up what lies beneath. The hills rise steeply, creating an enclosed world that feels separate from the everyday. The wind shifts, the water stirs, and you find yourself staring too long at ripples, wondering if they mean something more. The environment itself invites you to imagine, to fill in the blanks with creatures from legend. The first part of understanding the Loch Ness Monster, then, is not about photos or sonar or hoaxes. It is about place and story. It is about a loch that feels ancient, about a landscape steeped in folklore, and about a moment in modern history when people were ready to believe. The monster does not exist only in the water. It exists in the space between perception and imagination, in the gap between what we see and what we believe we might see. That is why it has lasted, why it continues to inspire, and why the name Nessie still carries a chill of mystery nearly a century after the world first heard it. The year 1933 changed Loch Ness forever. Before that moment, it had been just another body of water in the Scottish Highlands, impressive in scale but little known outside the region. Local tales existed, of course, but they had never reached far. That all shifted when a single sighting captured the imagination of the press, and then the world. It was not only the story of what was seen, but also the cultural moment into which it fell. People were ready for mystery. They were eager for the possibility that something ancient and unknown might still lurk in the shadows of the modern world. The sighting that began it all came from a couple driving along the newly constructed road that hugged the loch. The road itself mattered because it offered, for the first time, an extended view of the water from above. Travelers who once had little more than glimpses through trees could now see wide stretches of the loch. The couple reported that as they passed, they saw a massive creature rolling and plunging in the water, sending waves across the surface. They described something large, something alive, and though they could not define it clearly, the impression it left was undeniable. When the local paper published their account, it became more than just a curiosity. The editors gave it dramatic headlines, presenting it as the possible sighting of a prehistoric monster. From there, other papers picked it up, embellishing and repeating the story until it spread across Britain. It was exactly the kind of story the public loved. It had all the ingredients of a sensation, a mysterious creature, an ancient setting, and a sense that perhaps science had not yet explained everything. Within weeks, more people began to report their own sightings. Once the idea of a monster was planted, the human eye found evidence everywhere. Ripples, waves, floating logs, deer swimming across the loch, lines of otters, all could be interpreted as glimpses of Nessie. The ambiguity of the water made it easy to believe. Because the loch is so vast and dark, anything seen at a distance was unclear, and the imagination filled in the gaps. Soon, reports of humps, long necks, and massive shapes in the water filled the papers. This was not just about curiosity. The 1930s were a time when the world was fascinated by exploration and discovery. Fossils of dinosaurs had captured imaginations. The idea of surviving prehistoric animals felt thrilling, almost possible. Popular culture was already filled with tales of lost worlds and hidden beasts. Movies and novels played on the theme of creatures surviving in isolated places. Against this backdrop, the idea that Loch Ness might hide such a beast felt strangely plausible. The growing frenzy reached a peak in 1934 with the publication of what became known as the surgeon's photograph. It showed a long neck rising from the surface of the loch, exactly matching the image that had already taken hold in the public imagination. For decades, it was considered the definitive proof that Nessie was real. People cut the photo out of newspapers and carried it with them. Children copied it in drawings. It became the symbol of the monster itself, so iconic that even after it was revealed to be a hoax many years later, the image still defines how Nessie is imagined. The frenzy of the 1930s did more than spread stories. It changed the economy and culture of the region. Visitors began to arrive in the highlands hoping for a glimpse of the monster. Hoteliers, shop owners, and guides recognized the opportunity. Souvenirs appeared. Newspapers continued to publish stories because they sold copies. Loch Ness was no longer just a lake. It was a destination, a mystery, a brand. The people of the highlands suddenly found themselves living beside one of the most famous bodies of water in the world. What is striking when you look at the reports from this period is how varied they are. Some people described a serpent-like creature, others spoke of a whale-sized animal, some saw humps, some saw long necks, some saw disturbances in the water with no clear form at all. The details often contradicted one another, but the core idea was the same. There was something in the loch that did not fit with ordinary explanation. That flexibility made the legend harder to dismiss. Because there was no single image that had to be matched, almost anything unusual could be folded into the narrative. Skeptics pointed out that many of the sightings could be explained by natural phenomena. The shape of the loch creates waves known as seiches, standing waves that can appear suddenly and ripple across the surface in unusual ways. Boats can leave wakes that look strange from a distance. Animals like otters, deer, or large fish could easily be mistaken for something more mysterious, especially when the observer was primed to see a monster. But those explanations did little to slow the enthusiasm. The mystery was more compelling than the mundane. The impact of this first wave of sightings cannot be overstated. They took a local story and turned it into global folklore. Loch Ness was now on the map in a way it had never been before. And the legend became self-sustaining. Once the world believed that there might be a monster, people came to the loch expecting to see one. And when people expect to see something, they often do, even if only in shadows and ripples. Each new report reinforced the belief, which in turn produced more reports. It was a cycle that fed itself. By the end of the 1930s, the Loch Ness Monster was firmly established in popular imagination. It had become more than a curiosity. It was now one of the world's great mysteries, discussed alongside other legendary creatures. It carried with it the sense that the world was not fully known, that even in a place as settled as Scotland, secrets might still lie hidden. For a generation that lived in the shadow of rapid technological change, global depression, and the approach of war, that sense of mystery offered both an escape and a thrill. What began as a single sighting on a quiet Highland road had become a phenomenon. The loch itself had not changed, but the way people saw it had. Every ripple carried the possibility of a revelation. Every photograph, no matter how grainy, was scrutinized as potential proof, and the world leaned forward, eager to believe that something extraordinary was waiting just below the surface. The wave of excitement that swept through the 1930s did not fade quickly. Once the Loch Ness Monster entered the public imagination, it became an object of fascination not only for ordinary people but also for investigators, adventurers, and eventually scientists. Some were motivated by curiosity, some by the hope of fame, and others by skepticism. The result was a flurry of attention that only deepened the legend. Even as doubts grew, the mystery remained too powerful to let go. In the early years after the first sightings, people brought cameras to the loch, hoping to capture proof. Most of the photographs were inconclusive. Dark shapes appeared on the water, humps that could have been anything, wakes that looked unusual but lacked clarity. The famous image from 1934, later revealed as a staged hoax involving a toy submarine and a crafted model head, was the one that set the standard. It looked exactly like what people wanted Nessie to be, a long-necked creature resembling a prehistoric reptile. Though it was fabricated, it shaped decades of belief. Other hoaxes followed. Some were elaborate, others almost laughably crude. In one case, pranksters dragged a stuffed hippo foot across the ground near the loch to create fake tracks, fooling investigators until the trick was revealed. In another, photographs of floating objects were claimed to be Nessie but were later exposed as logs or debris. Yet the exposure of hoaxes did little to weaken the legend. If anything, they added layers of intrigue. Each hoax revealed showed how far people were willing to go to prove or disprove the monster, which in turn reinforced the sense that the mystery mattered. At the same time, there were accounts that resisted easy explanation. Fishermen swore to seeing something large moving beneath their boats. Drivers along the loch road reported necks and humps rising from the water. Pilots flying overhead described wakes cutting across the loch at impossible speeds. These stories varied wildly in detail but shared a common theme. Something about Loch Ness defied normal expectations. The sheer number of reports made it difficult to dismiss them all. Even skeptics admitted that the persistence of testimony required some form of explanation. By the 1950s, serious efforts to investigate the loch began to take shape. Amateur naturalists and professional scientists alike were drawn to the idea that Loch Ness might harbor an unknown species. Expeditions were organized with cameras, binoculars, and later more advanced equipment. One of the most well-known groups was the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, formed in the 1960s. Volunteers camped along the loch with long-lens cameras, scanning the waters day after day. They gathered thousands of hours of film, but the results were the same as ever: blurry shapes, unexplained wakes, photographs that hinted but never confirmed. The frustration of these investigations was part of what kept the story alive. If Nessie had been definitively proven to exist, the mystery would have ended. If it had been definitively proven not to exist, the story might have faded. But the constant stream of almost evidence, of tantalizing hints that refused to resolve, created a perfect state of ambiguity. The loch seemed to conspire with the legend. Its depth, its darkness, its sheer size made it possible to believe that something could remain hidden, surfacing only rarely and leaving little behind. Technological efforts continued to advance. In the 1950s and 60s, sonar surveys were attempted. Sonar was still a developing technology, but the promise was enormous. If the loch held a large creature, sonar should be able to detect it. Reports from those early surveys did reveal unexplained contacts, moving shapes in the depths that could not easily be identified. None of them offered definitive proof, but they were enough to sustain belief. Each new blip on a sonar screen became a headline, another reason to wonder what lay below. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Many scientists argued that the loch could not support a breeding population of large animals. The ecosystem was simply too small. Without sufficient fish or plant life to sustain them, such creatures could not exist in numbers large enough to survive over generations. Others pointed out that the cold water and limited nutrient supply made it an unlikely habitat for anything massive. These arguments were logical and grounded in biology, but they did little to quench the imagination. People pointed to the coelacanth, a fish thought extinct for millions of years, until it was discovered alive in the 20th century, as proof that science could still be surprised. If a creature could survive unseen in the ocean, why not in Loch Ness? The cultural power of Nessie during this time was immense. She appeared in cartoons, novels, and films. She became a symbol of Scotland, an image printed on souvenirs, postcards, and toys. Children grew up with Nessie as part of their imagination, half believing that if they visited the loch, they might just catch a glimpse of her. The monster shifted from a frightening possibility to a more playful icon, something that could be commercialized while still retaining its aura of mystery. The tension between Nessie as a beloved mascot and Nessie as a terrifying unknown was part of the fascination. Through it all, Loch Ness itself remained unchanged. Visitors stood at its shores, scanning the waters just as they had in the 1930s, waiting for something to break the surface. The loch offered the same dark depths, the same sudden waves, the same tricks of light and shadow, and because people were watching, because they wanted to see, they often did. Each ripple became a potential sighting, each shadow another story. The cycle of belief and skepticism, hoax and investigation, fed itself again and again. By the end of the 20th century, Nessie had become one of the most famous cryptids in the world. She was discussed alongside the Yeti, Bigfoot, and other legendary creatures. Unlike them, however, Nessie had the advantage of being tied to a specific, accessible place. Anyone could travel to the loch, stand at its edge, and hope for a glimpse. That accessibility gave the legend a tangible quality. It was not just a story told in distant lands, it was a mystery you could visit, a secret you could stare into, a question you could ask for yourself. The investigations of the mid-century may not have offered proof, but they did something else. They solidified Nessie as a legend that science could not easily dismiss and that culture could not let go. The lack of certainty became the very heart of the story. She was always almost there, always just out of reach, and that is where she remains, suspended in the space between skepticism and belief, an enigma that refuses to resolve. By the late 20th century, the Loch Ness Monster had become more than folklore. It was now a global phenomenon, an idea that lived not just in Scotland but in the imaginations of people around the world. Tourists traveled to the Highlands, scientists launched expeditions, and television crews arrived to capture the mystery. Nessie had moved beyond local legend into a space where belief, skepticism, and cultural fascination collided. In this period, the investigations grew more sophisticated. Technology that had once belonged only to navies or universities was turned toward the dark waters of Loch Ness. The hope was simple: if the monster was real, then better tools would finally prove it. One of the most famous efforts came in the 1970s when sonar was deployed in earnest. Earlier attempts had been small-scale, but this time, larger teams used advanced equipment to sweep wide sections of the loch. The results were frustratingly ambiguous. Blips appeared on screens, showing large moving objects beneath the water. The shapes were too big to be ordinary fish, too fast to be drifting debris, yet they were not clear enough to identify. Some of these sonar traces were published widely, fueling new excitement. To believers, they were proof that something lived in the depths. To skeptics, they were simply inconclusive anomalies. Photographs also became a focus. Long lens cameras were stationed along the loch, waiting for any disturbance. A handful of images captured strange shapes breaking the surface. One showed a dark hump against the water. Another revealed what seemed to be a neck rising briefly before vanishing. As always, the problem was clarity. The images were distant, blurred, distorted by light and waves. Skeptics argued they showed nothing more than logs, birds, or boat wakes. Believers pointed to the consistency of form, arguing that too many people had seen the same shapes for them all to be mistakes. The most famous of these photographs came from a man named Robert Rines in 1972. His team captured underwater pictures with strobe lights and cameras set below the surface. One of the photos appeared to show a flipper-like appendage, something that looked strikingly like the limb of a prehistoric animal. For years, this image was touted as the best evidence of Nessie's existence. Magazines published it, documentaries aired it, but later re-examinations raised doubts. The picture was grainy and murky, the shape ambiguous, and some experts argued it could easily have been sediment, debris, or photographic error. Despite these doubts, the flipper photo re-energized the legend. It coincided with a wave of popular interest in cryptids, fueled by television specials and sensational books. Nessie was no longer just a Scottish curiosity. She was part of a worldwide movement to explore the unknown, grouped alongside Bigfoot, the Yeti, and other creatures that straddled the line between folklore and science. People were drawn to the idea that the modern world might still hold mysteries untouched by explanation. Loch Ness became a pilgrimage site for believers, a place where the boundary between myth and reality felt thinner. At the same time, skepticism grew stronger. Scientific voices became more insistent that the loch simply could not sustain such a creature. The biology did not add up. A population of large animals requires food, breeding numbers, and ecological balance. Loch Ness, cold and nutrient-poor, could not provide enough resources for even a small group of massive creatures. Even if one animal existed, it could not survive long without others. And if there were others, they would be seen far more often. The argument was compelling, and many people accepted it. But belief in Nessie is not fueled by logic alone. It is fueled by the longing for mystery, and so the legend endured. The 1980s and 90s brought more organized searches. Teams of volunteers lined the loch with cameras and telescopes, forming human chains of observation. Universities joined expeditions, combining sonar, photography, and acoustic monitoring. Each time, the results were the same: strange readings, curious images, but nothing definitive. The monster seemed always just out of reach, always refusing to give itself up to certainty. This pattern, repeated again and again, became part of the story itself. Nessie was elusive not because she did not exist, but because her existence was bound to ambiguity. She was real in the space between what people saw and what they could prove. The rise of mass tourism in the Highlands made Nessie even more visible. Visitor centres were built, boat tours offered trips across the loch, and gift shops filled with plush toys, mugs, and shirts bearing the monster's image. For locals, Nessie was more than a legend. She was an economic engine, drawing millions of pounds in revenue each year. This commercialization changed the tone of the story. Where once the monster had been terrifying, now she was often playful, depicted with cartoonish charm. Families visited not to fear the creature, but to celebrate her mystery. Yet beneath the smiling mascots, the darker, older story still pulsed, reminding people that the loch might hold something stranger than souvenirs. As the century closed, technology advanced once more. Sonar became sharper, cameras clearer, satellites more precise. Each new tool promised to solve the riddle once and for all. Yet even with these advances, nothing conclusive emerged. The monster seemed to thrive on ambiguity, appearing in ways that evaded certainty. The paradox was striking. The more effort people put into proving Nessie, the more the evidence seemed to retreat into uncertainty. It was as if the legend needed mystery to survive, and the loch itself conspired to provide it. By the end of the 20th century, Nessie stood at a crossroads. She was beloved and iconic, a symbol of Scotland recognized worldwide. She was also embattled, criticized by skeptics who saw her as nothing more than myth sustained by tourism and imagination. But she endured. People continued to come, to watch the water, to hope. The loch remained as deep and dark as ever, its surface a mirror for human imagination. Whether Nessie was a living creature, a cultural myth, or a reflection of our desire for wonder, she had secured her place in history. The modern era of investigation showed something profound. Nessie is not simply about whether a monster exists. She is about the human need to search, to believe, to stand at the edge of the unknown and wonder what lies beyond. The sonar traces, the blurry photographs, the endless hours of watching the water are not failures. They are rituals of curiosity, proof that mystery still matters in a world that feels increasingly explained. That is why Nessie remains, not in the depths of the loch, but in the minds of those who look upon it and feel the possibility that something waits just out of sight. By the time the 20th century reached its close, the Loch Ness Monster had transformed from a frightening legend into something more complex. Nessie was no longer only a creature glimpsed in the shadows of a dark Scottish loch. She had become a cultural symbol, beloved and commodified, yet still cloaked in enough mystery to keep people watching the waters. This shift from terror to icon did not happen overnight. It was the product of decades of sightings, media coverage, scientific investigations, and the growing tourist industry. To understand Nessie fully, one must look not only at what was seen but also at how she was imagined, marketed, and celebrated. In the earliest days of the modern legend, Nessie was treated with a mixture of fear and awe. Reports from the 1930s described something massive, almost monstrous, rolling and plunging in the water. The image was not playful. It was uncanny, frightening in the way it challenged what was known. But as decades passed, and as evidence failed to solidify, the public perception began to shift. The monster became less of a threat and more of a mystery. And mystery, unlike menace, could be embraced by families, children, and visitors from around the world. This change can be seen most clearly in how Nessie was depicted. Early illustrations showed a serpent-like beast, jaws wide, looming from the waves. Later images softened those edges. Cartoons and souvenirs presented her as a friendly creature with large eyes, rounded features, and an almost smiling expression. Nessie was no longer a predator, she was a mascot. This transformation was partly deliberate. Local businesses recognized that families would be more eager to visit a loch guarded by a whimsical monster than one haunted by a terrifying beast. The legend was adapted to suit the needs of tourism. The rise of tourism around Loch Ness was astonishing. Small villages that once relied on fishing, farming, and modest local trade found themselves at the center of a global attraction. Hotels filled with guests who came not only to explore the highlands, but to scan the waters for Nessie. Shops sold mugs, t-shirts, plush toys, and postcards. Bus tours lined the roads. Boat operators offered rides across the loch with the promise, however slim, of catching a glimpse of something unusual. The monster had become an economy. For some, this commercialization cheapened the legend. Skeptics argued that Nessie was sustained less by sightings and more by souvenirs. To them, she was no longer a creature of mystery but a tool for marketing. Yet even as the image softened and spread across keychains and posters, the core fascination remained. People still stood at the loch's edge, staring into the water, hoping for ripples that might prove something extraordinary lay beneath. The commercialization did not erase the mystery, it amplified it, making Nessie a shared experience rather than a hidden secret. This duality is part of what makes the Loch Ness Monster so enduring. She is both a playful symbol and a profound mystery. On one hand, she adorns children's books and tourist trinkets. On the other, she represents the possibility that the world still holds secrets. These two sides may seem contradictory, but together they create a legend that is accessible to everyone. You do not have to believe in Nessie to enjoy her story. You do not have to dismiss her to buy a plush toy. The legend functions on multiple levels, appealing to wonder, skepticism, humor, and awe all at once. Cultural symbolism also plays a major role. Nessie is not just Scotland's monster, she has become part of national identity, a figure that connects Scotland to the global imagination. Tourists may come for the castles, the highlands, and the history, but many also come for Nessie. She represents mystery tied to place, a creature inseparable from the loch and the landscape around it. This connection between legend and geography is powerful. The monster cannot be relocated. She belongs to Loch Ness alone. That bond gives the story authenticity, grounding it in a real place, even as it drifts into myth. Nessie's transformation into an icon also reflects changes in how people approach folklore in the modern age. In earlier centuries, legends often carried warnings. Water spirits like kelpies were depicted as dangerous, teaching caution around lakes and rivers. Nessie began in that lineage, a possible threat in the dark water, but modern culture prefers wonder to fear. The unknown is no longer treated only as menace but as potential magic. By softening Nessie into a symbol of mystery rather than a source of danger, society made her more enduring. Children can love her, adults can laugh with her, and believers can still search for her. The shift also highlights how legends adapt to survive. If Nessie had remained a frightening beast, perhaps the story would have faded as skepticism grew. But by becoming a playful mascot, she avoided dismissal. She became more than a monster to believe in or disprove. She became an idea, a cultural figure that needed no proof to matter. People could reject her existence as a creature and still embrace her as a symbol. In that sense, Nessie succeeded where other cryptids struggled. She transcended belief. Despite this transformation, the darker undertones have never fully disappeared. Serious investigators still scan the loch with sonar and cameras. Believers still tell of sightings that chilled them, of shapes too large to explain, of wakes cutting through calm water. Nessie may wear a smiling face on souvenirs, but beneath the surface of the legend, she remains unsettling. The idea that a massive, unknown creature could lurk unseen in one of the largest and deepest bodies of water in the British Isles still sparks unease. The tension between mascot and monster is what keeps the story alive. Culturally, Nessie has also become a symbol of skepticism itself. Scientists often cite her as an example of how folklore persists in the absence of proof. She is invoked in debates about evidence, belief, and the line between myth and reality. In this way, she plays both sides. To believers, she is hope. To skeptics, she is a cautionary tale. Either way, she is central to conversations about how humans deal with mystery. By the end of the 20th century, Nessie stood at the intersection of legend and icon. She was no longer only a creature rumored to haunt a loch. She was a brand, a symbol, a cultural figure whose meaning shifted depending on who was telling her story. Some saw her as Scotland's ambassador of mystery, others saw her as a harmless cartoon. Still others saw her as an unresolved riddle in need of proof. The genius of Nessie is that she can be all of these at once. That flexibility is why she has endured while so many other legends have faded. The Loch Ness Monster is not trapped in a single role. She adapts. She frightens, she entertains, she sells, and she inspires. She is a monster and a mascot, a hoax and a hope, a joke and a profound question. And because she can be all these things, she remains alive in the imagination of millions. Loch Ness itself may be quiet and still, its waters dark and cold, but in the minds of those who look upon it, Nessie swims eternally, shifting form to suit the story that needs to be told. To understand why the Loch Ness Monster endures, one must look not only at the loch and the legends but also at the human mind. Nessie lives as much in psychology as she does in folklore. The persistence of sightings, the allure of the mystery, and the resilience of belief despite decades of inconclusive evidence all point towards something deeper than a simple story of an unknown animal. They point to the ways in which perception, expectation, and desire shape what people see and what they are willing to believe. The loch itself provides a perfect stage for this drama. Its waters are vast, dark, and often turbulent. Waves appear unexpectedly, caused by wind, currents, or the wakes of boats. Light shifts across the surface, creating illusions of depth and movement. A log floating half-submerged can look like a back rising from the water. A line of swimming otters can mimic humps in succession. Deer crossing the loch can create splashes that seem far larger than they are. In such an environment, the human eye struggles to interpret what it sees. Ambiguity becomes fertile ground for imagination. Once the idea of a monster was seeded in the 1930s, that imagination had direction. People arriving at Loch Ness expected to see something unusual, and expectation has immense power over perception. Psychologists call this phenomenon expectancy bias. When someone anticipates a particular outcome, their senses filter information in ways that reinforce that anticipation. At Loch Ness, ripples that might otherwise be ignored become suspicious. A shadow on the water becomes a neck. A disturbance in the distance becomes a revelation. The mind fills in gaps with what it expects to find. This does not mean witnesses are lying. In fact, most sightings are reported sincerely. People truly believe they saw something extraordinary. But sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. Memory is malleable. The details of what was seen shift and solidify over time, shaped by stories heard, images seen, and the broader cultural narrative. A witness may initially describe only a large shape, but after days of retelling and hearing others' accounts, that shape might grow a long neck or a hump. The story becomes clearer in memory even as the original perception fades. The power of suggestion also plays a role. For decades, newspapers, books, and documentaries have repeated the same basic image of Nessie, a long-necked, plesiosaur-like creature rising from the loch. That image becomes imprinted in the mind. When someone sees something ambiguous in the water, they unconsciously match it to the familiar form. The monster takes on the shape it is supposed to have. In this way, the legend self-perpetuates. Each sighting reinforces the image, and each new image makes the next sighting more likely to resemble it. Another factor is the human attraction to mystery. People are drawn to the unknown, to the possibility that the world still holds secrets. The Loch Ness Monster offers a kind of wonder that modern life rarely provides. In an age of satellites, global travel, and constant surveillance, there are few places left where something large could remain hidden. Nessie represents the hope that not everything has been explained, that something marvelous might still be waiting. For many, this hope is reason enough to keep watching the loch. Even if no proof emerges, the possibility sustains the fascination. The legend also plays into a deeper psychological theme, the fear and allure of deep water. Humans have long associated lakes, rivers, and oceans with mystery and danger. The surface hides unknown depths. Something could be just below, invisible but present. Loch Ness, with its extraordinary depth and dark, peat-stained water, magnifies this unease. Standing at its edge, one cannot see more than a few feet into the murk. The imagination supplies the rest. The monster becomes a projection of the primal fear of what lurks beneath, a fear as old as humanity itself. Group psychology amplifies the effect. When multiple people stand together and see something unusual, their interpretations influence one another. If one person points and says they see a long neck, others are more likely to agree, even if they only saw a ripple. Collective belief builds quickly, and what begins as ambiguity solidifies into shared conviction. Once a group has agreed that something extraordinary was witnessed, the story gains weight. A single person can be mistaken, a group, it seems, cannot. But groups are not immune to suggestion, they are often more susceptible. This helps explain why reports of Nessie are often clustered. A high-profile sighting in the news sparks a wave of additional reports. People come to the loch primed to see something, and they do. The cycle repeats itself across decades. A burst of media attention leads to new sightings, which fuel further attention, which in turn produces more witnesses. The legend feeds on itself, not through deception but through the natural patterns of human psychology and culture. There is also the simple joy of participation. To say you saw Nessie is to join a global conversation, to add your voice to a mystery that has fascinated millions. It is a way of connecting personal experience to a larger story. Whether or not one believes entirely, there is excitement in telling the tale. That excitement is reinforced by the reactions of others, who lean in, listen, and wonder. The act of sharing becomes as important as the act of seeing. The psychological dimension of Nessie does not weaken the legend. If anything, it strengthens it. The monster exists in the interplay between perception and belief, between the mind and the loch. That interplay is what keeps her alive even in the absence of proof. People do not need to see Nessie clearly to believe in her. They need only to stand at the water's edge, look into the darkness, and feel the possibility that something is there. That possibility is enough. This is why the Loch Ness Monster has resisted the erosion of time and skepticism. She is more than a creature, she is an idea, and ideas thrive where ambiguity lives. The loch provides endless ambiguity. The human mind provides endless imagination. Together, they sustain a legend that has endured for nearly a century. Whether Nessie is flesh and blood or figment does not matter as much as the fact that people continue to look, to hope, and to believe. In the end, the psychology of Nessie is as fascinating as the folklore or the science. She shows how humans interact with the unknown, how expectation shapes vision, how memory reshapes experience, and how desire fuels belief. She is a mirror of the mind as much as a mystery of the loch, and that may be the most powerful reason she has never gone away. The story of the Loch Ness Monster is not built only on the broad strokes of folklore and psychology. It is carried forward by individual moments, by specific sightings that captured attention and shaped how the world imagined Nessie. These accounts, scattered across decades, stand out because of their detail, their timing, or the way they were received. Each one added something new to the legend, sharpening its image or renewing its urgency. To look at them closely is to see how a collection of encounters, each filtered through memory and interpretation, came together to form one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. One of the earliest modern sightings occurred in 1933, just as the road along the loch opened and offered clearer views of the water. A couple driving near Invermoriston described seeing an enormous creature crossing the road in front of them and slipping into the loch. They said it had a large body, greyish skin, and a long, undulating neck. The detail that it left the water and moved across land was striking, setting this account apart from the many that described disturbances on the surface. If true, it suggested not only size but mobility, a creature at home both in the depths and on shore. This report helped fuel the frenzy that would follow, convincing many that the monster was not merely a trick of water but something solid and alive. Then came the sighting by Hugh Gray in November of the same year. He took what is often considered the first photograph of the monster. The image showed a blurry shape on the water, elongated and strange, though skeptics argued it could have been a dog swimming with a stick in its mouth. Despite the doubts, the photograph circulated widely. It was the first visual anchor for the legend, something tangible that could be printed in newspapers and studied by readers. Gray's photo set the stage for the decades of photographic evidence that would follow, a mix of blurry, suggestive, and ambiguous images that would be interpreted endlessly. The most famous sighting of all came in 1934 with the so-called surgeon's photograph. It showed a long, elegant neck and small head rising from the loch, perfectly matching the mental image of a surviving prehistoric creature. For years, it was considered definitive proof, reproduced in countless books and documentaries. Only decades later was it revealed as a hoax, a staged image using a toy model. Yet even after the revelation, the photograph continued to shape Nessie's image. People could not forget it. It had already imprinted itself on the cultural imagination, becoming the default vision of the monster. Other sightings over the years added different dimensions. In 1951, a man named Lachlan Stewart photographed 3 humps rising in a line across the water. To some, it suggested a massive creature undulating beneath the surface. To others, it was nothing more than hay bales floating. Regardless of the truth, the image rekindled public attention. Each time interest began to wane, another photograph or eyewitness report seemed to appear, as if the loch itself knew when to reawaken curiosity. In 1960, an aeronautical engineer named Tim Dinsdale filmed what he believed to be the monster swimming across the loch. The film showed a dark object moving at speed, leaving a wake behind it. Experts studied the footage, with some concluding it showed a living creature and others dismissing it as a boat filmed in poor light. What mattered was not consensus but the drama of the debate. Dinsdale's film became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence, inspiring further investigations and reinforcing the idea that science might yet prove Nessie's existence. The 1970s brought a wave of sonar contacts and underwater photographs. Robert Rines and his team captured images that seemed to show flipper-like appendages and strange shapes moving in the depths. These images were grainy, difficult to interpret, but for a time they were hailed as breakthroughs. Newspapers published them with breathless excitement, and television documentaries presented them as serious evidence. Once again, skepticism followed, pointing out possible photographic distortions or debris. But the pattern repeated itself: tantalizing evidence, heated debate, and renewed fascination. The legend thrived not in resolution but in uncertainty. Beyond photographs and sonar, there were countless eyewitness accounts, each unique in detail. Some described long necks, others spoke of humps rolling through the water, still others swore they saw eyes glinting in the evening light. A fisherman might tell of his boat being rocked by something massive beneath the surface. A tourist might describe a wake cutting against the wind. A pilot flying overhead might point to a shape moving just below the surface, too large to be explained by known animals. These stories varied wildly, but together they created a sense of something larger than coincidence. The significance of these famous sightings lies not only in what was seen but in how they were received. Each time an image or report emerged, it traveled through newspapers, books, and later television, and the internet. Each account became part of a growing tapestry, woven together into a shared cultural narrative. The monster's image was shaped less by biology than by storytelling. Hugh Gray's photo suggested size. The surgeon's photograph provided a neck and head. Dinsdale's film offered motion. Rines's flipper added anatomy. Piece by piece, the legend took on form, constructed not in laboratories but in the imagination of millions. Skeptics point out that these accounts reveal more about human perception than about the loch. Blurry photographs, ambiguous shapes, and personal testimonies are the raw material of folklore, not zoology. Yet the power of these sightings cannot be denied. They gave the monster life beyond the loch, spreading her image far beyond Scotland and embedding her in global culture. Whether hoax, mistake, or genuine encounter, they ensured that Nessie remained a living legend rather than a forgotten curiosity. It is also worth noting that many witnesses had no incentive to lie. Fishermen, travelers, and locals who told their stories often gained nothing but skepticism in return. Some even faced ridicule. The sincerity of these testimonies, even if flawed in detail, is part of what sustains belief. People trust that so many witnesses cannot all be wrong. The weight of numbers itself becomes evidence, even if each individual account remains uncertain. In the end, the famous sightings do not prove Nessie's existence. They prove her endurance. They show how a handful of photographs and testimonies, amplified by media and memory, can create a legend that resists skepticism and thrives on debate. Each sighting adds fuel to the fire, not because it solves the mystery, but because it deepens it. The monster remains always just out of reach, glimpsed in shadows, photographed in blurs, and remembered in fragments. That is enough to keep her alive in the human imagination, where she may swim far longer than in any loch. By the time the 20th century was drawing to a close, the search for the Loch Ness Monster had evolved from curious stares along the shoreline into organized scientific expeditions. The mystery had reached a scale where casual photographs and personal testimonies were no longer enough to satisfy those who sought answers. With new technology emerging, researchers believed that if Nessie existed, the tools of modern science could finally settle the question. This era produced some of the most ambitious searches ever attempted, blending genuine scientific curiosity with the enduring allure of folklore. One of the first large-scale efforts was conducted in the 1960s by the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau. This group stationed volunteers around the loch, armed with cameras and binoculars, with the hope of capturing something definitive. Thousands of hours of footage were recorded, but as always, the results were frustrating. Strange wakes appeared, dark shapes crossed the water, yet when studied, none of it stood beyond dispute. The human eye remained too prone to error, the camera lens too limited in clarity. The loch gave up suggestions, but never certainty. In the following decades, technology shifted from surface watching to probing the depths. Sonar, once reserved for military and research vessels, became the tool of choice. The loch's size and darkness made it a natural target for acoustic scanning. Early sonar sweeps revealed unexplained contacts, large moving shapes beneath the water. To believers, these were glimpses of Nessie herself. To skeptics, they were fish schools, floating debris, or quirks of the equipment. The ambiguity continued. The sonar traces fascinated, but they did not prove. In 1972, Robert Rines and his team from the Academy of Applied Science used sonar in combination with underwater photography. They lowered strobe lights and cameras into the depths, hoping to capture images of whatever sonar detected. The photos that emerged were murky but dramatic. One seemed to show a diamond-shaped flipper, a limb-like structure that looked eerily like it belonged to a prehistoric creature. For years, that image was hailed as the best evidence ever captured, but later analysis suggested it might have been nothing more than sediment, air bubbles, or photographic distortion. Once again, the promise of proof dissolved into uncertainty. These disappointments did not stop further attempts. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, expeditions returned with more advanced sonar arrays. Some claimed to track large, moving objects in the loch. One group described a sonar contact the size of a small whale, moving steadily before vanishing into deeper water. The story was electrifying, yet it remained just that, a story. The contact was not recorded clearly enough to settle the matter. It was more fuel for debate rather than a conclusion. By the 1990s, satellite imagery, thermal scanning, and more precise sonar systems were being used. Scientists approached Loch Ness with the rigor of oceanographic study, yet time and again, the results were inconclusive. The loch offered up mysteries but never a clear revelation. In some cases, anomalies were detected, but follow-up efforts failed to relocate them. It was as though the monster revealed herself only to slip back into ambiguity whenever certainty loomed. The irony was striking. The more advanced the technology became, the more slippery the mystery grew. Each new expedition was announced with excitement, hailed as the one that would end the debate. Each one returned with results that invited more questions than answers. In some ways, the loch seemed designed to resist clarity. Its immense depth, its dark, peat-stained waters, and its complex currents all combined to create illusions. A sonar echo might be a school of fish or a submerged log. A photograph might capture sediment stirred by waves. A wake on the surface might be nothing more than wind. And yet, because the possibility of Nessie was already planted, each of these anomalies became evidence to some. This cycle shaped the modern narrative of Nessie. She became less a creature of the water and more a creature of uncertainty itself. Science tried to cage her in data, but she slipped away into shadows and blurs. What emerged was a paradox. The legend thrived not in spite of scientific scrutiny, but because of it. Every inconclusive expedition was framed not as disproof, but as another layer of intrigue. If the most advanced tools could not rule her out, then perhaps she was truly there, hidden in ways that defied easy detection. At the same time, the expeditions themselves became part of the folklore. News reports and documentaries turned each search into a story of its own. Viewers followed the scientists as they launched boats, lowered sonar, studied screens, and reacted to blips and shadows. Even when nothing was found, the process reinforced the sense that something was worth looking for. Nessie remained newsworthy not because she was proven, but because she refused to be disproven. The late 20th century also brought a shift in tone. While early believers often approached the monster with fear or awe, modern expeditions were framed more around curiosity and wonder. Nessie was increasingly seen not as a threat but as a puzzle. Scientists admitted that even if she did exist, she likely posed no danger. The search was not about protection but about discovery. This softened perception made Nessie even more accessible, turning her into a mystery that anyone could enjoy rather than a danger to be feared. As the 21st century approached, the scientific searches continued, but they also became more symbolic. Nessie had become so entangled with culture and tourism that each new expedition felt as much about sustaining interest as about solving the riddle. Television specials showed sonar sweeps and underwater cameras, but audiences were often more interested in the drama of the hunt than the evidence itself. The expeditions provided spectacle, even when their findings amounted to little. What stands out about this era is the persistence of effort. Despite decades of inconclusive results, people kept returning to the loch with new tools and new determination. This persistence speaks to something deeper than scientific inquiry. It reveals a human need for mystery, for a frontier that resists explanation. Nessie filled that need. She gave modern people, living in a world mapped and measured, a place where the unknown still thrived. The expeditions were less about capturing a creature and more about preserving that possibility. By the dawn of the new millennium, the scientific era of Nessie had reached a kind of equilibrium. Advanced tools had scanned the loch from top to bottom. Anomalies had been found, debated, and often dismissed. No proof had emerged, but no final dismissal had been accepted either. Nessie remained suspended in that space between belief and doubt, untouched by certainty. The monster had become an idea that science could neither confirm nor banish. And in that ambiguity, she endured, swimming forever in the minds of those who continued to look at the loch and wonder what lay beneath. The Loch Ness Monster is not just a local curiosity or a Scottish legend. Over time, Nessie became part of a global family of mysterious creatures said to dwell in lakes, rivers, and oceans across the world. To understand her place in culture, it helps to compare her with these other beings, because together they reveal something universal about human imagination. Wherever people live near deep water, stories emerge about what might be hidden beneath. Nessie may be the most famous, but she is not alone. In Canada, tales of a creature named Ogopogo have circulated for centuries among the Okanagan people and later settlers near Lake Okanagan. Like Nessie, Ogopogo is described as serpent-like, sometimes with humps, sometimes with a long neck. Sightings began in indigenous traditions long before cameras or newspapers spread them, suggesting that the impulse to populate mysterious waters with hidden creatures runs deep. Modern reports describe wakes, humps, and dark forms in the lake, often mirroring the kinds of accounts heard at Loch Ness. The parallel is striking. Two lakes separated by an ocean, two cultures separated by continents, and yet the same core legend emerges. In Scandinavia, there are stories of the Storsjöodjuret, the great lake monster said to inhabit Lake Storsjön in Sweden. The descriptions again echo Nessie, a serpent or dragon-like form seen rolling through the water. Sightings date back to the 17th century, and in the 19th century, local newspapers began reporting encounters. spreading the tale much as Scottish papers had done. The monster became part of the lake's identity, attracting visitors and fueling speculation. Across the world, in Africa, stories of the Mokelembembe describe a creature said to live in remote rivers and swamps, often likened to a surviving dinosaur. While not tied to a lake in the same way, the legend shares with Nessie the sense of something prehistoric surviving into the modern age, hidden in environments that resist human intrusion. Explorers and cryptozoologists have chased this story much as they have chased Nessie, blending folklore with a longing for discovery. Even in the United States, Lake Champlain in the northeast has its own legendary creature known as Champ. Sightings date back centuries, and modern reports continue, with locals and tourists alike claiming to see long shapes moving through the water. Champ has even been given legal protection by local governments, a nod to both cultural heritage and tourism. Like Nessie, Champ has become a mascot, appearing on merchandise, logos, and souvenirs. These parallels show that the Loch Ness Monster is part of a larger pattern. Human beings look at large, deep, and dark bodies of water and project life into them. The unknown becomes inhabited. The fear of what might lurk beneath becomes a story, and that story becomes a creature. It is no accident that so many of these creatures resemble serpents or prehistoric animals. Serpents are among the oldest symbols in human myth, and dinosaurs captured the modern imagination in the 19th and 20th centuries. Combining those images into lake monsters gave shape to a very old fear and a very modern fascination. What makes Nessie stand out, however, is not only the similarity to these other legends, but her unique success in capturing worldwide attention. While Champ, Ogopogo, and others are well known in their regions, Nessie became a global icon. Part of this has to do with timing. The 1930s were a period when mass media could spread a story far and wide, and the surgeon's photograph gave a concrete image that the world could latch onto. No other lake monster had such a perfect combination of timing, imagery, and cultural readiness. Nessie became the template for how lake monsters were imagined. Nessie's fame also grew because of the setting. Loch Ness itself is hauntingly evocative. Its sheer size, its depth, its dark waters all create an environment that feels mysterious even before any story is told. Visitors stand at its shore and feel the weight of something hidden. That atmosphere is harder to replicate elsewhere. Other lakes may be large, but few have the same brooding character. The landscape of the highlands, with mist, stone, and steep hills, lends itself to myth in a way that feels almost cinematic. Another reason for Nessie's global status is the persistence of evidence, however ambiguous. Other lake monsters are often reported only occasionally, their stories rising and fading. Nessie, by contrast, has generated a steady stream of sightings, photographs, sonar contacts, and documentaries. Each decade brought new material to keep the legend alive. The continuity gave Nessie a resilience that other creatures lacked. She was never allowed to fade into the background. She remained part of cultural conversation, resurfacing whenever interest began to wane. The result is that Nessie became not only Scotland's monster but the world's. She is referenced in films, cartoons, and novels. Her image appears in children's books far outside of Scotland. She is invoked in debates about cryptozoology, used as an example in arguments about evidence and belief. Nessie has transcended her loch in a way few other creatures ever have. Yet despite her fame, she remains tied to Loch Ness. Unlike Bigfoot, who is imagined roaming vast forests, or the Yeti, who belongs to the high Himalayas, Nessie cannot be moved. She is not just a monster, but a place. To speak of her is to speak of the loch itself. This bond makes her legend more tangible. Tourists do not simply think about Nessie. They go to her home, stand at the water's edge, and look for themselves. That physical connection grounds the myth in reality, even when no creature appears. The global parallels also show how legends adapt to cultural needs. In Scotland, Nessie became a symbol of national identity and tourism. In Canada, Ogopogo was connected to indigenous tradition and later regional pride. In America, Champ became a local mascot. In Sweden, the Storgör tied into national folklore. Each creature reflects both universal human fears of deep water and the specific cultural context in which the story grew. Nessie's uniqueness lies in how her legend bridged local identity with global fascination. In comparing her to these other creatures, one begins to see that the Loch Ness Monster is not only a story about a possible animal, she is a story about storytelling itself. She demonstrates how myth, memory, and media combine to create a legend that can outgrow its origins. Nessie is both one among many and one apart, part of a global pattern but also the singular face of lake monsters everywhere. When people imagine mysterious creatures hiding in water, they imagine her. That is her legacy, more enduring than any photograph or sonar scan. By the 21st century, the Loch Ness Monster had become more than a legend of unexplained sightings. Nessie was now firmly woven into global culture, functioning as a bridge between science, tourism, media, and entertainment. Her story was no longer confined to quiet testimonies of locals or the grainy photographs of hopeful visitors. Instead, it had grown into a cultural industry, producing films, television specials, books, and a steady stream of tourism that continues to shape life around the loch. What began as a mystery of the water had become a story of how myths adapt to survive in the modern world. The entertainment industry played a powerful role in this transformation. Nessie began appearing in films as early as the mid-20th century, often portrayed as a prehistoric creature that had somehow survived into the present. These early portrayals leaned into the monstrous, imagining her as a threat to be confronted or destroyed. Later depictions softened, reflecting her transformation from frightening unknown to beloved curiosity. Children's movies began to feature Nessie as a friendly creature, misunderstood rather than dangerous, hiding from the world rather than attacking it. These portrayals mirrored the shift in public perception. As science failed to confirm her existence, she was reimagined in more playful, symbolic terms. Television documentaries also became central to the Nessie story. Every few years, a new special promised to reveal evidence or launch the most advanced search yet. Crews filmed sonar scans, interviewed witnesses, and recreated famous sightings. These programs rarely produced definitive conclusions, but that was not the point. They kept the legend alive, packaging it for new audiences. Viewers around the world could sit at home and participate in the search, feeling the tension of each blurry photo or unexplained sonar reading. The cycle repeated itself: promise, mystery, ambiguity, and renewed fascination. Tourism, however, became the strongest anchor for Nessie in the modern world. The area around Loch Ness now thrives on visitors drawn by the monster. Tour boats cruise the waters daily, their guides pointing out famous locations of sightings and encouraging passengers to watch for ripples. Visitor centers showcase the history of the legend with photographs, films, and even recreations of sonar blips. Shops line the roads with merchandise ranging from mugs and t-shirts to plush toys and keychains. Restaurants name dishes after Nessie. Hotels decorate their rooms with imagery of the monster. For many visitors, the chance to stand at the edge of the loch and imagine Nessie is as important as visiting castles or hiking in the Highlands. This tourism boom has transformed local life. Villages that might otherwise have remained small and quiet now draw international travelers year-round. The economy is deeply tied to the monster's legend, and for many residents, Nessie is not just a mystery but a livelihood. While skeptics may dismiss her as myth, they cannot deny her economic impact. The loch is now one of the most visited locations in Scotland, and Nessie is central to that appeal. At the same time, Nessie has become a figure of humour and light-heartedness. Cartoons portray her peeking playfully from the water. Advertisements use her silhouette to promote products. Festivals celebrate her with costumes and games. She is not only a subject of scientific debate or folklore, but a shared cultural joke, one that can be told with affection rather than cynicism. People buy plush Nessies for their children, take selfies with statues of the monster, and laugh about her while still gazing at the water just a little too long, just in case. This blending of humour and hope is unusual in folklore. Nessie is taken seriously and not seriously at the same time, and that balance has kept her relevant. The media's constant return to Nessie also reflects a deeper cultural need. In a world of constant information, where mysteries seem fewer, she remains one of the last great enigmas tied to a specific, physical place. Unlike ghost stories or alien abductions, Nessie has a home that can be visited. This tangibility makes her legend more enduring. People can physically go to Loch Ness, stand on its banks, and feel part of the story. The location itself becomes a stage where imagination can thrive. What makes Nessie's role in modern culture especially fascinating is the way she bridges categories. She is not just folklore, not just entertainment, not just tourism, not just a scientific puzzle. She is all of these at once. To scientists, she is a challenge, a reminder of how people interpret ambiguous evidence. To locals, she is an industry. To children, she is a friendly creature of stories. To travelers, she is a mystery worth journeying to see. To skeptics, she is a case study in belief and misperception. Few legends function on so many levels simultaneously. Nessie has also become a metaphor in broader culture. When people refer to a Nessie in another field, they often mean a mystery that refuses to be solved, a question that lingers no matter how much evidence is gathered. Her name has become shorthand for the elusive, the debated, the possibly imaginary yet stubbornly persistent. This metaphorical use shows how far she has travelled from the Loch. She now lives not only in Scottish waters but in the global lexicon of mystery. Despite her playful presence in modern media, Nessie has never lost her core aura of mystery. Visitors still report sightings, newspapers still publish the occasional photograph or sonar anomaly. Scientists still debate whether there could be large eels or other explanations hidden in the Loch. The commercial and humorous aspects may dominate the surface, but underneath, the original question remains alive. Could there be something unknown in Loch Ness? That possibility, however slim, sustains the entire cultural edifice. The endurance of the Loch Ness Monster in modern culture demonstrates how myths adapt to survive. Nessie could easily have faded after the surgeon's photograph was revealed as a hoax, or after sonar sweeps failed to find proof. Instead, she shifted roles. She became playful, symbolic, and commercial while still retaining a shadow of mystery. That flexibility is what ensures her survival. She no longer depends on proof or fear. She thrives on ambiguity, humor, and hope, a blend that allows her to belong to everyone in different ways. The story of Nessie in modern media and tourism is therefore not just about a monster in a loch. It is about how humans keep myths alive, reshaping them to fit the times. Nessie was once a terrifying beast glimpsed in shadows. Now she is a beloved mascot of mystery, a creature that sells souvenirs while still drawing scientists to scan the water. This dual existence may seem contradictory, but it is precisely what has kept her legend strong. She is both serious and playful, a riddle and a cartoon, a question and a brand. Few myths have managed to achieve that balance, and that is why the Loch Ness Monster remains one of the most famous legends of all time. In the 21st century, the search for the Loch Ness Monster entered a new phase. The tools of folklore and eyewitness accounts had long been exhausted. Photographs and blurry films no longer carried the weight they once did. Sonar sweeps, though fascinating, had provided only anomalies without answers. Science had advanced to a point where the mystery could be tackled with entirely new methods, and researchers were eager to put Nessie to the test. If something large was truly living in the loch, the 21st century should be the time to prove it. One of the most significant efforts came with the use of environmental DNA, a method that allows scientists to gather genetic material from water samples. Every creature that swims through a lake leaves behind tiny fragments of skin, scales, or waste that can be detected and sequenced. By collecting samples across Loch Ness and analyzing the DNA, scientists could build a detailed map of what species live in the water. This was, in theory, the most definitive way to confirm or rule out the existence of a large, unknown animal. When the results of the environmental DNA study were announced, they caused a wave of discussion. The analysis identified fish, birds, insects, and mammals, but it revealed no evidence of a giant reptile or prehistoric creature. What it did find, however, was an unexpectedly high concentration of eel DNA. This led some researchers to propose that Nessie sightings might be explained by unusually large eels. The idea of giant eels rising through the water could account for some of the shapes described in reports. It was not as thrilling as a surviving plesiosaur, but it offered a naturalistic explanation rooted in evidence. The eel theory divided opinion. Skeptics embraced it as a sensible conclusion. Believers found it unconvincing, pointing out that eels, however large, could not account for every description, especially the reports of humps or necks rising above the surface. Others noted that the DNA study had not truly proven giant eels existed in the loch, only that ordinary eels were abundant. The eel theory became another layer of speculation, a possible answer but not a final one. As with so many aspects of the Nessie story, the results fed debate rather than resolving it. Other modern approaches included high-resolution sonar mapping of the loch's floor. Teams mapped trenches, ridges, and hidden channels, hoping to find places where a large creature could hide. The maps revealed fascinating geological features, including unexpected depths and crevices, yet none of these features contained definitive evidence of a monster. Once again, the loch provided mystery but no clear solution. Drone technology also entered the search. Small, unmanned aerial vehicles scanned the loch from above, offering new perspectives on the water's surface. Thermal cameras were used to detect temperature anomalies that might indicate large animals moving below. While these methods produced interesting data, none revealed Nessie herself. What they did reveal was the sheer complexity of the loch, its currents, its shifting temperatures, and its deceptive patterns. The more the loch was studied, the more it seemed designed to trick the human eye. Meanwhile, sightings continued into the 21st century. Tourists and locals alike reported disturbances in the water, some captured on modern digital cameras. Video clips showed ripples or dark forms, but even with better technology, the results were still ambiguous. The clarity of cameras had improved, but the conditions of the loch, distance, weather, and water color, meant that evidence still appeared blurry and uncertain. Nessie remained as elusive as ever, even in the age of smartphones. Some argued that the persistence of sightings, despite modern skepticism, revealed something about human nature. People continued to see Nessie because they wanted to. The monster had become an expectation, a presence felt as much as seen. Others argued that the very act of looking created the legend anew each time. Tourists traveled to Loch Ness hoping for a glimpse, and in their desire, they often found something worth telling. The monster had become a partnership between the loch and the imagination. For scientists, Nessie offered a case study in how folklore interacts with evidence. She became an example used in classrooms and lectures to discuss perception, psychology, and the challenges of interpreting ambiguous data. In this sense, Nessie's significance extended beyond cryptozoology. She became a teaching tool, a symbol of how humans grapple with the unknown. Whether or not a creature lurked in the depths, the story of Nessie revealed profound truths about how people build and sustain legends. Culturally, Nessie continued to thrive. Even as DNA studies and sonar scans failed to find proof, she remained central to Scottish identity and tourism. The absence of evidence did little to diminish her appeal. Visitors still came, souvenirs still sold, and media still returned to the story. Nessie had moved beyond the need for proof. She had become myth made flesh in the minds of those who believed, and no amount of negative data could erase that. This paradox defined the 21st century Nessie. She was studied more thoroughly than ever before, yet she remained untouched by science. She was dismissed as implausible, yet her fame grew stronger. She was revealed as elusive, yet she was everywhere, in shops, in books, on screens, and in the hearts of those who hoped. She had become more than a question of biology. She was now a phenomenon of culture, economy, and imagination. In many ways, the environmental DNA study marked a turning point. It showed that even the most advanced scientific methods might not end the debate. The eel theory provided a plausible explanation, but it lacked the magic people wanted. No one wrote children's books about giant eels. No one traveled across the world to buy a toy shaped like a fish. Nessie thrived because she represented something larger, the possibility of wonder in a world too often explained. Science could suggest alternatives, but it could not erase the longing for a creature just beyond reach. The 21st century investigations revealed that the legend of the Loch Ness Monster was no longer a battle between belief and disproof. Instead, it had become a collaboration between science and story. Each expedition, each study, each result fed back into the legend, ensuring its survival. Nessie was no longer dependent on being real in the biological sense. She was real in the cultural sense, real in the stories told, the tourism sustained, and the imagination sparked. That reality was, in some ways, even stronger than the existence of a creature in the loch. By this point, Nessie was not just a question for scientists or a draw for tourists. She was a living symbol of the human relationship with mystery. She embodied the tension between what we know and what we hope, between evidence and belief, between skepticism and wonder. That tension is why the Loch Ness Monster endures in the 21st century, not as a solved riddle but as an open invitation to imagine. The Loch Ness Monster began as a ripple in the water, a fleeting story told by a couple in the early 1930s. From that moment, the world leaned forward, and for nearly a century, it has not looked away. What started as a curious local tale has grown into one of the most enduring legends of modern times, a story that has traveled across continents, crossed cultures, and embedded itself in the imagination of millions. Yet as we reach the end of the long journey through Nessie's lore, evidence, and cultural life, we are left not with certainty but with something more complicated, and perhaps more valuable. The mystery of Nessie has never been resolved. No body has been found, no clear photograph has silenced the skeptics, no scientific study has revealed a creature in the loch. Yet, she has never been disproven either. The loch continues to produce anomalies, stories, and sightings that keep the possibility alive. This ambiguity is the very heart of the legend. Nessie survives in the space between belief and doubt, between what people think they see and what can be proven. That space is fertile ground for myth, and Loch Ness has nurtured it for generations. What makes Nessie unique is not only the possibility of a creature but the way her story reveals truths about ourselves. At its core, the legend speaks to a deep human need for wonder. In a world where satellites map every inch of the surface, where deep-sea submersibles plumb the oceans, and where information spreads instantly, there are few mysteries left that feel close and tangible. Nessie offers one. She is a reminder that not everything has been catalogued, that perhaps, just perhaps, there are secrets left in the dark places of the earth. That reminder is powerful, and it keeps people returning to the loch year after year. The story also reflects how humans interact with the unknown. We see shapes in ripples, we imagine monsters in shadows, we turn wakes into creatures and blurs into proof. Nessie reveals the fragile line between perception and belief. She shows how stories, once seeded, grow through memory and expectation. A log becomes a back, a deer becomes a serpent, a wave becomes a neck, and yet, even knowing this, people are not deterred. The desire to believe outweighs the caution of skepticism. Nessie endures because she gives shape to that desire. Over the decades, Nessie has transformed. She was once feared, then doubted, then loved. She has been a monster, a mascot, a tourist attraction, and a metaphor. Each generation has shaped her to reflect its own needs. In times of discovery, she was imagined as a surviving prehistoric creature. In times of skepticism, she became a playful icon. In times of scientific advance, she became a puzzle to be studied. This adaptability has kept her alive where other legends faded. Nessie is not trapped in a single role. She shifts, like the loch itself, always changing yet always recognizable. Culturally, she has become larger than the loch. Nessie is now a global icon, known far beyond the Highlands of Scotland. She represents not only a specific mystery but the very idea of mystery itself. She has appeared in films, books, games, and art. She is invoked in debates about evidence and belief, used as an example of how humans handle uncertainty. She has become shorthand for any question that lingers unsolved. To speak of Nessie is to speak of the persistence of the unknown in a world that pretends to know everything. Economically, she has transformed the Highlands. Loch Ness would always have been beautiful, but Nessie turned it into a destination known across the world. Millions of visitors come not only for the landscape but for the legend. They buy souvenirs, They take boat tours. They stand on the shore with cameras ready. This tourism sustains communities and embeds Nessie into the everyday life of the region. She is not only a myth, but a livelihood. Scientifically, she has become a case study. The endless searches, the sonar traces, the environmental DNA studies all reveal more about human inquiry than about the loch itself. Scientists know that Nessie is unlikely to exist as a biological creature, yet they continue to study the loch, driven partly by curiosity and partly by the need to confront one of the world's most famous mysteries. Each expedition adds to our understanding of the loch, even if it does not add to our understanding of the monster. In this way, Nessie has contributed to science, not by being real, but by inspiring investigation. And so, as we consider the Loch Ness Monster today, what conclusion can be reached? The simplest is that she is not real, that she is a combination of hoaxes, misidentifications, and the tricks of light and water. Yet to end the story there would be to miss its deeper meaning. Whether or not a creature swims in Loch Ness, Nessie exists. She exists in stories told by locals, in the hope of tourists, in the pages of books, in the eyes of children staring at ripples, in the debates of scientists, and in the laughter of families buying souvenirs. She exists because we need her to. The legend of the Loch Ness Monster reveals something profound about being human. We are not content with what we can measure and prove. We are drawn to the edges of knowledge, to the places where certainty falters. We create monsters in those spaces, not because we are foolish, but because we are imaginative. Nessie is not a failure of science, she is a triumph of wonder. She proves that even in a modern, mapped, explained world, there is still room for mystery, still space for belief. Standing at the shore of Loch Ness, it is easy to see why. The water stretches long and narrow, dark and deep, bordered by steep hills and veiled in mist. The surface ripples unpredictably, hiding more than it reveals. The loch invites you to stare, to wonder, to hope. Perhaps that is the real secret. Nessie was never only in the water. She was always in the minds of those who look upon it. And in that sense, she will never vanish. The Loch Ness Monster may not be flesh and blood, but she is real where it matters most. She is real in imagination, in culture, in memory, and in the eternal human need for wonder. As long as people look into dark waters and ask what might be there, Nessie will swim on, just out of reach. A shadow, a ripple, a story waiting to be told again.